Before the fight, what were we saying about this? Well, certainly what was I saying during this broadcast? You can go back and review it. I told you guys I would not necessarily be surprised if Khalil won, not because I thought overall he's a better fighter or better striker on pure terms than Poatan, but he is experienced. He was on like a 5-fight win streak, but more to the point, he's explosive, powerful. The margin of error is slim. It's the biggest night of his career. There's a lot of tape now on Alex Pereira. The longer you do this, the harder it becomes to maintain it because everyone can find little nuances and little weaknesses. And he throws with intensity. He throws with explosivity. Yeah, like absolutely something could happen. And you saw some moments where he got threatened a little bit. We'll talk about that in just a second. But some of that was a big portion of that. I think we all saw was really true. What did Khalil Rountree do well in this fight? Well, first of all, I think he game planned really well. He had, for a time anyway, he was able to check some of the outside leg kicks that you wanted that Poatan was trying to do because they were an open stance. So it's southpaw versus orthodox. He was able to kind of hand fight and keep that lead hand covered. The left hook was not a super prominent weapon this time around. In fact, it was more the right hand of Poatan, among other things as well, obviously, that did the majority of his best work. That actually ended up being a bigger component. And part of that was because what did you see from Rountree? Not just the parrying of the lead hand, but then the parrying and then peeling out. And he was even doing that as he got tired, as the fight wore on. So he came prepared. Like they knew defensively what they needed to do. I think in general, you can make an argument, as the commentary booth did. I think I heard them say this, that he should be pressuring Poatan because Poatan has nowhere to retreat to. He's going to be a little bit easier to hit. Easier said than done to actually do that. However, as I mentioned during the watch along, that was definitely the case in UFC 306 with Merab and Sean O'Malley. Sean would try and throw something at Merab, and Merab was the one pressing. So when he had to evade and escape, he had the entirety of the octagon behind him. It was a similar kind of dynamic here. Poatan kind of is like a little bit rigid, kind of has his hands like this, and then just sort of leans out of the way. He does slip a little bit. You did see a couple of slips and counters, but he more just kind of leans and then retreats, which you can do in MMA because you typically have a lot of space to work with. You could make an argument that they kind of should have had a better plan to do that. But again, very easy to say, oh, just pressure Alex Pereira backwards. Like, it's not so simple. So what they did have planned for was in anticipation of his pressure. It seemed to me that was the game plan that they were working with. It looked to me like what they wanted was a place to stand their ground when they needed to and actually make him kind of overcommit so they could get him on the blitz forward, and they could do it with 3 and then 4 punch combinations. It's going to be hard to single shot him. He can block, he can pull away, he can do whatever he needs to do. Even 2 of them, you can throw 1, 2, and the second one will kind of get up there, but even then, he'll put a second line of defense. But if you use one hand to cover, another hand to shield, and then you just lean back, it's the third and then the fourth one that are going to find you. And I think you saw there was a great degree of that. And he was fast with it too. I think Rountree's speed early gave Poatan some problems. Rountree's explosivity, he was able to quickly react anyway, right? And with big power. And those blitzes in anticipation of the pressure that Poatan put on him gave him a lot of problems. It gave him a lot of problems. In fact, this was the interesting part about this fight to me, was that Poatan didn't have that fourth round assault that we saw was a lot. He was showing you everything he had. But up until that point, it was kind of nip and tuck. It was a lot of jabs. It was a lot of stabs to the body. It wasn't a lot of he hit him with a big left hook and then he got rocked and, had to rally. It wasn't that. He kind of had to just slowly cut at him, drain him. And then once he became more mobile, once he became less explosive and less reactionary, that's when he really began to pour on the pressure, get him to overextend on his own left, and then counter him. That was really what he was looking for. That's what I mean about the slipping. That's when he was able to pull out of the way, re-angle, and then go for the attack. But early on, the speed, the power, the putting the punches together, the checking of the leg kicks, the lead hand cover. Dude, Khalil Rountree fought a good fight. Fought a really good fight. They were they had a clear assignment in mind, and I think for 2 3 rounds, basically, he played that for the most part pretty well. He shut down the head kicks, really, of Poatan to the point where his corner was telling him to stop throwing it. And of course, he threw, I think, one more after that, but he didn't go to it nearly as much. He went back to the stabbing up the middle, but like he threw a middle kick and it got parried, and then he came over the top. Like they had an answer for a lot of traditional weapons that Poatan likes to throw, and it really kind of set him off. He had to kind of rebuild from scratch a little bit in the middle of this fight with behind the jab. And it was after that with the jab, then the leg kick, kind of like slowly putting these things together, and some of the stabs up the middle to the body. Some of that stuff was pretty good. Once that started cooking, then he could build stuff after that. But Rountree and his team, they got him in good physical condition. I think wasn't a perfect game plan, but a very certainly one that had success early. And shut down, made Poatan really have to go deep into his bag of not even tricks. That wouldn't be the right thing to say, would it? It wasn't like Poatan won on clever misdirection. He won on real hardcore tight fundamentals that saved him in the end. That's really what, and of course, championship experience, apportioning his cardiovascular reservoir correctly, centering himself emotionally for all this kind of stuff. But I have such high praise for Khalil Rountree. The guy came into this fight, I think this was his first fight out of the Apex in 3 years. 3 years. He's been fighting in front of, television cameras and a very difficult opponent or whatever, but not like this. This was so different. And you didn't know what it was going to do to him. Was it going to derail him? Was it going to be a little bit too much for him? There was a lot of different things he had to handle. He went from fighting nobodies to good fighters to ranked contenders, but all of this in the expanse of the Apex. And then you have to go fight for the title. You're the 8th ranked guy. You haven't even fought a top 5 guy at this point. And you have to do it against basically the most, Poatan has, we'll talk about him in just a second, but, one of the most important fighters in the UFC today. I think it's a very fair way to put that for Alex Pereira. And you had a great game plan. You were in good shape. You were giving this guy all kinds of problems. You had ready-made answers for some of his most core weapons, and you had to really make him earn it. Basically, I know, obviously Izzy polished him off in that rematch, and of course that was one of the best knockouts we've ever seen. But in terms of fights that went the distance, I think Izzy had 2 rounds on him heading into the 5th of theirs. So obviously that's another case where somebody was giving him problems, but it felt like in the striking, Izzy could, how do I say this? Izzy had moments in the striking with Pereira. Again, I'm not talking about their first MMA fight, not their kickboxing fights. And obviously polished him off in the second. But in that first one, it felt like he was scoring, but remember he had that whole round where he was doing a lot of wrestling. He wasn't, and he always had trouble deterring Poatan. And in the end, Poatan's pressure would not be deterred here either. But it really felt like Khalil was landing on him in very powerful, scary ways. Certainly for the first time against anybody at light heavyweight. I mean, I can say that very, very clearly. Izzy obviously had success in a number of different ways, some more limited than others, but he had a lot of success against him. But this was very scary, or certainly, troubling if you were a Poatan fan early. So I just want to inventory all of that for Khalil Rountree. All of that went right. Now, in the end, it wasn't quite enough, because when the explosivity began to diminish, and when he wasn't able to get the blitzes going, and his defense wasn't quite as dialed in and ready to work, and so all of these things began to chip at him. When it went downhill, it didn't go downhill immediately, but there was no coming back from that. I think that's a pretty good way to put it. Once Poatan really began to implement what he wanted to do against a more stationary, hittable, less explosively dangerous opponent, the fight got away from him. But I have great respect for what Khalil Rountree and his team cooked up. I have great respect for the kind of peril at times that he had Poatan in. Remember when he missed on the head kick and then he fucking clipped him? I think it was the right hand. had him in, a little bit on skates there for just a second. And then more to the point, we should say this about Khalil Rountree for just a second here. Sean Strickland says a lot of things, and a lot of it is very nonsensical, and I try not to pay attention to it. And you'll recall, Sean's already been mocked for this because he mocked himself, Khalil, for crying once, and then he goes on the Theo Von podcast and he can't even literally contain himself. And this is a thing that I don't think Sean should be mocked for either. It's really not why I'm bringing it up. I don't mean to exploit his trauma for cheap discussion points on YouTube, but rather I want everyone to take a look, not just at how well Khalil Rountree performed, but can anybody with a straight face say today that you saw even an ounce of athletic cowardice on the part of Khalil Rountree today? Can anybody even try to say something like that? That guy went out on his shield in the most badass, in your face, giving you, the viewer, me, you, all of us, giving Poatan, giving the UFC, and then in a sense, the opportunity itself, every physical thing he had to offer on this day. No questions asked. Look at what he courageously sacrificed today on the altar of athletic greatness. Pure heart from beginning to end. Pure will from beginning to end. I've talked about this term before, gameness. Sadly, the term comes from dogfighting, but it has a very interesting definition. The definition is pursuit of the fight despite the physical consequences. Ladies and gentlemen, is there a better example in 2024 of gameness than what Khalil Rountree showed today? There might be one or two, but that's going to be in the conversation for all, not all-time gameness, but certainly within this year, certainly among the opponents that at light heavyweight that Poatan has faced. That is a phenomenal display of gameness. The guy's eye was shut. I bet his insides feel like they've been set on fire. His nose looked completely fucked up. Did you see the giant booger of blood the size of a fucking pterodactyl fall out of his face when he was trying to talk to Joe Rogan? This dude is going to be in pain for a long time. He gave it all in service of a fight, in service of a dream, even when it was probably, matter-of-factly, impossible to win. He went out swinging for as long as his mind and his body could physically will him to do so. So this is why you cannot believe the words of bullies. This is why you cannot believe the words, especially if you're like an athlete, and even for people who, like me, I have a job where I have to be critical. You cannot believe the words of critics, a lot. You cannot believe the words of bullies. You cannot let somebody showing, and what Khalil Rountree did, a human emotion at one time, because these guys, they feel quite deeply in all ways. It's a very difficult job that they do, and it requires a lot of them to do it. I want you to remember this day. Remember this performance. It's not just that when he's winning, he shows you like fucking incredible heart and determination. Even on the losing side, he went out with the will of the toughest SOB you'll ever see. So credit to him. Credit to him for showing everyone in a situation where it actually mattered what kind of heart and determination he's got, what kind of will he's got, what he is actually made of. Now you get a chance to see what Khalil Rountree is actually made of. And I hope everybody takes a moment to appreciate that.